I think you and I were talking once about a project I heard about in one of the former Soviet republics in Central Asia, where they tapped a reservoir there, really quite productive, but the pressures, the temperatures, and the chemistries of the fluids coming out of the ground were so challenging that my understanding was that they had to do unique metallurgy, never done before, to figure out what to make the pipes and valves out of that wouldn't just be immediately corroded by this stuff coming out of the ground. That's non-trivial. You look at what needs to be done to drill the Brazilian pre-salt formation off the coast of Brazil. This is a really technically challenging project. So the upfront innovation and capital investment and investor patience seems to be on an upward trend in many cases for some of these supplies. And that's where I think you can kind of take that argument that the Nate Hagans of the world might suggest as being, hey, that's a little bit of a red light on the dashboard.
A warm welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Jimmy Fortuna. Jimmy is the Chief Product Officer at Enverus, and today we're going to have I think, very exciting discussion, building on some of our previous podcasts on the question of peak cheap oil. Jimmy, it's a pleasure having you on. You have supported us in the past. If folks want to check out our video, our tour of the Baraka nuclear power station, which we tagged on to the end of our COP trip, Jimmy and his wife Brandy were instrumental in making that happen. So it's great, Jimmy, to finally get you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Chris. It's delightful to be here. Really looking forward to it.
So, Jimmy, tell me a little bit about who you are, your background, and we'll get to your thoughts on this. But I want to introduce you to the listenership a little bit better.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Chief Product Officer at a company called Enverus, which is not widely known outside of the energy sector. We cut a relatively low profile because we're a privately held company in a specialized space. But we have over $500 million in revenue, and the only thing we do is serve the energy sector with technology, essentially. And I'm the Chief Product Officer of that firm. So I've been with the company about 8.5 years now, and been delighted to be part of a lot of growth and expansion across the energy mix. We serve pretty much every part of the energy mix in most regions of the world. But we are especially astute at North America and hydrocarbons and electric power generally in many places in the world. So that's a little bit about us. As such, we are focused on helping our customers do something that we call, and our company mission, power the global quality of life. We don't produce energy, but they do. And by helping them be successful, we help fulfill our mission. So that's a little bit about us. And I've been an energy geek since I was a little kid. Had a formative experience during the so-called gas crisis of 1973. One of my earliest memories was sitting in the back seat of a car with my mom and dad, and then worried about whether or not they'd get to the front of the gas line. So I've been fascinated with energy ever since.
Yeah, I mean, it's an experience that in the developed world, none of my generations had to go through. So, what else do you remember about that other than being stuck in line?
Well, a lot really. Like for people that are younger, they may not be able to appreciate just how impactful those events were in the 70s to everyday life. The United States had been, kind of striding the world as the post Second World War, global champion, arsenal of democracy, bastion of freedom, free enterprise, all that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden, holy cow, we're really exposed to real shocks to our economy as a result of being dependent on petroleum imports, and that was made very vividly and suddenly clear. I don't think people had realized that exposure was there prior to that time, and it was really quite a shock to the economy. I mean, it's called we use the word crisis today. It feels like for everything that happens in the news, but it really was quite a deep impact. You had real impacts on people's lives. The affordability of energy was a really serious issue, and you had just a ton of adjustments going on of the kind that were pretty disruptive to people. Like, hey, I'm gonna take apart my house and insulate it because it was built without insulation. Not a that's pretty disruptive. Or I'm gonna change the kind of fuel that my car runs on. I mean, in some DIY projects when people really kind of got deep into it, um, it was a really transformative time, and it impacted a lot of American manufacturing, especially the automobile industry. And there was also a tension, I should point out, between energy supplies and cost, and also environmental pollution at the time. We just had the Clean Air Act passed, and those mitigations to emissions of things like automobiles and manufacturing and electric power generation, those came at additional costs. So just as energy prices were going up quite dramatically in a number of ways, so too were costs associated with environmental improvements, and there was a lot of turmoil about all of that during that decade.
Right, right. I was just reading a little bit, slightly related topic, but really the kind of return to coal that we saw there, where stop burning oil for electricity in a number of places around the world, but also the Synthetics Fuel Corporation. I think it was under Carter, but $20 billion were at least put aside to develop a synthetic fuels industry based upon the South African Statoil experience, where they make a lot of liquid fuels out of coal. So interesting. So 1973 also coincided with what Marion King Hubbard theorized would be peak oil in the U.S. And I believe it was in terms of conventional production, but he failed to foresee both offshore development and more recently the fracking boom. So I think that's kind of what we're here to talk about today. There's a question of peaking of supplies, peaking of economically accessible supplies, and the geology of that, and also the politics and the geopolitics. And I think that's sort of what we're going to be chatting about today, taking us on a bit of a world tour of where oil is produced and some of the intricacies and how that plays into some of the dynamics that we're going to be seeing over the next several decades. So I'm not sure if you want to jump in and take it away from there, if there's anything else kind of by way of introduction you wanted to get out of the way.
Yeah, a little bit more intro stuff. So a couple things. If I'm your listeners, I'm curious as to like, hey, this Enverus outfit does technology for energy. I don't. That doesn't maybe provide a lot of context. I'll provide a little bit more. A key part of what we do. It's not a very large part of our revenues actually, but it's a really important part of our value for customers. Is that we provide essentially what amounts to the type of analysis and advice that you would get on from an investment advisor. And in fact, we have a registered investment advisor part of our business. What makes that special for us, and I think different, is that we're not buy side and we're not sell side, because we actually don't own any energy equities. We don't own any energy assets. So our opinion is not in any way influenced by what our business interests are. We're just supposed to get it right. And I think our customers value that, because so much research out there actually comes from the position of somebody that actually has a vested interest somewhere in the energy mix, and we very scrupulously do not. So I think that's one of the things that makes our investment research and our technical research on the technical fundamentals of what the basis of value and risk are so sought out after by our customers, and in turn that draws them into our technology, because we use our technology in order to make those assessments. So that makes us a little different, and I think it's worth pointing out, because I'm going to talk about some technical details like geology and other things later, and now that the listeners have that background, they know that that's how it works for us. And it's also very important that I say up front that nothing that they hear on this podcast is investment advice. So that's pretty key. And I'm also going to sprinkle in opinions of my own that are not necessarily opinions of the firm. So when that's the case, I'll try to make that clear. Um, and so with that, I think we can dive in, Chris, and I'll kind of not bury the lead, and let everybody know that with all respect to prior guests like Nate Hagens and Art Berman and Garrigan Rosenzweig and others, we find agreement with some points, or kind of some parts of their message, but not on this idea that geological drivers of scarcity are the major concern, at least not for the foreseeable future. Other things are, and we'll talk about those. But and I'll also give a hat tip to Doomberg. He and I had a conversation about this. Like, you can tell from my childhood experience, scarcity and dependency for energy supplies is something that left a mark early for me. And so when I look out ahead, sometimes I'm looking ahead further than our investors are, honestly, because that's or energy investors are, because that's part of my job. It's also part of my childhood paranoia. So I had some discussion with him, and that was that helped kind of inform, I think, the way that we would talk about this today to some degree, as a great analyst. Yeah.
And to be clear, when you talk about the investor time horizon versus your personal one, scars that was from the energy crisis in the 70s, what are we talking about here? Um,
Yeah.
Decades. It's hard for human beings to think out very far, I find, into the future. But
Yeah, it's funny. Investor time horizons are generally pretty short. They're looking at 5 and 10 year windows typically, and probably more on the 5 side than the 10 side. Honestly, capital just moves around a whole lot more than it used to decades ago. When I think investment positions tend to be a little bit longer held than they are today. There's been so much dynamism in the economy and so much rapid growth in things like the tech sector that capital is less patient than it used to be. And consequently, I think investors' time horizons are relatively short. So, they might be looking at, say, a 5 year window, and they really want to get really dialed into that. And I think that's important because as energy becomes more in demand, as more of the world lifts itself out of poverty, so you see absolute energy demand just continues to go up and up and up. I don't think that's going to stop. And the sources that we pull from and need to are have significant capital intensivity, and sometimes they necessarily have long return windows. We on Decouple we talk a lot about nuclear. Nuclear is a long time frame kind of thing, both from build and returns on investments. And then it doesn't look like 5 years. You're not investing your money and getting yourself whole and making a nice return on your investment in a 5 year window, with many energy investments, and that's important. Especially as I think investment timescales are going to continue to grow over time for larger parts of the energy mix and affect supply and demand balances, and therefore price.
right, right. And just before we head on our world tour, one last thing: if the investor time horizon is so short, how does that drive like the analytics? Obviously, some of the money going into figuring out what the data is, what the inputs are telling us. Um, there's funding that's coming in, and that's more interested in that 5 or 10 year time horizon. So, how do we know what we know going further out into the future?
Well, yeah. So I think there's two questions inside that question. I would say one of the effects on the analysis is the shorter the time frame, the more precise things need to be. The unaccountable number of variables. You just have to sort through it, and you have to try to make your best assessment of what the impacts are going to be within that window. And so, precision, I would think, is the word: precision and comprehensiveness. And so that's you can't. No matter how good you do that, you can't control global commodity prices. Those are essentially unpredictable. I mean, everybody makes predictions; they're all wrong. The only question is, how wrong are they, and when do they start being wrong? So, but everything else, you really want to understand geology. You really want to understand the engineering details of how particular assets are produced from, whether that's molecules or electrons. You want to understand where things are most likely to get developed, and many other details of how both electric power and hydrocarbons work. And it requires a kind of a totalizing understanding of systems, everything from wellhead to transport to refining, to markets. On the hydrocarbon side, and on the electric power side, it's similar. That you've got this sort of upstream original generation of the electricity all the way through to the end consumer. And so that 5 year window, precision, you want a lot of precision and a lot of detail, and customers want to understand the underlying details that caused you to get to where you got. In terms of the further you go into the future, it's not that customers don't want things like a price model, 20 and 30 years from now. It's just everybody begins to discount those more and more into the future as you would, right? Because uncertainty grows no matter how hard you try. So that does that help answer the question?
Yeah, yeah, no, I think it does. I think it does. Okay, so help us paint a structure then of where we're going. You wanted to look at things kind of by geographic region.
Yeah, so let's be a little oil centric at first. We're going to talk about gas too, but since we've been in your prior episodes, you've been focused on the carbon pulse and whether or not we're running into a potential danger zone with oil and gas. We'll focus a little bit more on oil first, and we're going to take a world tour of producing regions. Actually, five of them that we look at. And I think it might be educational for people to understand kind of how those things group together and how we look at it, because we think it's helpful to understand balances in world supply. So we'll take our grand tour, and our five regions, and regions are sometimes groupings that aren't geographical. Our five regions are OPEC, so the OPEC cartel, Canada, America, the United States, Russia, and then the last one is something that Enverus calls NOCAR, which means not OPEC, Canada, America, or Russia. It's essentially everything else. And so there's some embedded surprises, I bet, for some listeners in each of those five things. And so, and I'll say as we go through them, you're going to hear some things that sound a little bit like steel manning the bears on supply, the folks like Nate Hagens and so on, as we should. I think, we'll steel man their argument and then also talk about why in the end we don't think that it's actual fundamental scarcity geologically that's a risk, at least not for the foreseeable future. So let's start with OPEC. Okay, so OPEC, I think a lot of people understand, generationally, it's been around since 1960, started by five countries during that time. And if we look at today-ish, it's about 31% of world supply. That's a basket of 12 countries. Very large oil, production per country on average. And today, or really by the end of 25, let's call it about 33.1 million barrels per day. Right, so just under a third of world supply. And they are. It's important to understand what OPEC is. OPEC is a cartel. What does a cartel do? A cartel tries to make sure that price is favorable to the cartel members, and usually by limiting production. Okay, so they formed for that purpose. It's let's not oversupply the market because that actually hurts us as producers. Remember that an oil producer, doesn't matter whether it's a country or a company, their purpose is maximizing revenue. It's not maximizing delivered hydrocarbons. It's making the most money that they can, right? And if you're a member of OPEC, you want the money to be as big as it can be for as long as it can possibly be. And so, therefore, if you have a choice between volume and price, you're going to pick price, and preserve your volumes as long as possible. And that's just all to say, if it's not obvious for people, their point is not to produce as much as possible. That they're often oriented towards the opposite. It's how to not produce too much, right? You can't understand OPEC without understanding Saudi Arabia. They're the dominant producer. They're I think fully a third of OPEC's production by themselves.
And just to keep those numbers simple, and I mean, a lot of the audience already knows this, but we're talking about 100 million barrels per day that's consumed. So that's a nice round number. So you're saying around 30 million barrels per day, so a third. And so Saudi Arabia would be about 10, 11, I guess.
Yeah, it's in that neighborhood. And so, yeah, so you're right. It's 100 million barrels a day. OPEC by the end of next year, we project it will be about 33 of that 100. So, right on a third. And Saudi Arabia is about 10, round numbers.
I'm just trying to think of which countries joined in, why, and just off the top of my head, I'm thinking these are probably countries which derive the majority of their revenues from oil. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, yeah. So you look at a typical OPEC producer, substantially all of the economy is the production of hydrocarbons.
Okay.
Yeah, and they depend on that more than you might think. So, a lot of these countries import a lot of food, for example. So that foreign exchange is not trivial in terms of its value. It's really important. So if you have prices that are too low for too long, you start running into some pretty serious questions. It can be existential. So when the cartels are trying to manage price up, it's not just because they want lots of very expensive and nice things. They've got to make sure that they maintain social stability also.
I spent some time in Venezuela in the early 2000s, and got a sense of a little bit of the history there. And such, part of the reason for the volatility, there's many reasons, was just the exceptional swings in the price of oil, and sometimes the austerity measures that were required to sort of state to balance its books. And they call it the black curse for a reason, I guess. But um, understandable why these countries that are so dependent on that as an almost sole source of revenue, wanting to keep things stable, as you're saying, keep the society stable, um, keep the patronage stable. But yeah, okay.
Yeah. So one little thing about Saudi that I wanted to point out, uh, recently they canceled plans to add reserve capacity. So they were going to add a little bit more capacity. Think about it's good to have reserve capacity if you're in OPEC because you can influence the balance of supply and demand, which sometimes they like to do. Like they'll punish people who overproduce by saying, okay, you want to challenge us, we'll flood the market and crash your price. And now, how do you like that? They've done that before. So Saudi Arabia was in the process of saying they were going to add some spare capacity. They've since backed off of that. And instead, what they've decided to do is to expand on gas. Now, it would appear that the goal of that might be twofold. One, there's an increasing gas market globally. Certainly, were very high price signals a year or two ago. Second, they can substitute domestic oil burn, which they use for things like electric power production, by using gas instead, which I think a lot of people would argue is a better choice, right? So they can supply more to the world in terms of oil, not by adding the rate at which they're producing, but by simply shipping more out of the country instead of burning it internally. And beyond even their gas production for that purpose, it looks like with discussions with the United States, they're trying to emulate the UAE now, and add some domestic nuclear power generation as well. So the more they have a nuclear based grid as opposed to a hydrocarbon based grid, the more hydrocarbons they can export.
And how much oil are they burning in terms of their own power needs for things like electricity or desal? Do you know?
I should have looked that up before we got started, but I don't know. It's
Right.
not trivial. The
Yeah.
the domestic demand for hydrocarbons is quite significant, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
So again, OPEC, the actual producers are they basically all state owned companies?
Yeah,
Aramco.
these tend to be state-owned enterprises, and they are essentially directed by the state. They're secretive. It's very different than the United States or Canada, where you and I live, where what oil and gas companies do is very well documented. Lots of records are publicly disclosed, including things like geological records. What reserves are. Engineering techniques. Environmental issues when they arise. There's all kinds of deep disclosure. From the private oil and gas companies that operate in places like your country and mine. For these national oil companies, no, that's not how they operate. They have very little interest in disclosing anything. It's more like state secret sort of stuff. And these countries will very much leverage technical expertise from elsewhere in the world, where it's suitable for them to do so. But there's not a lot of transparency.
Right. Right. And finally, is this all conventional oil? There's not a lot of offshore or fracking or anything happening in OPEC countries, at least at this point.
Yeah, we'll touch on that a little bit later. But there's very little production from shales in these countries yet, except for Saudi Arabia, which is beginning to produce from the Jafurah shale, which is a very gassy shale, and that's where some of that gas expansion that I mentioned earlier is coming from. There is a fair amount of offshore activity in the region, especially when you look at gas as an example. Qatar's North Field is a colossus, and it's that's offshore. I'm pretty sure most of it. So There's a fair amount of offshore stuff, but there's also quite a lot on land, more so.
Okay. Okay. Ready to move on from OPEC?
Sure. So let's take the next stop, Russia. Okay, so a lot of people don't know they've been a producer for over 100 years. They today-ish, so we project by the end of 25 they'll be supplying about 10.8 million barrels a day, and that's about 10% of the world supply, 10.3%. Um, what a lot of people don't know, there's a really long history between Russia and the West in terms of oil production that actually goes back into the Soviet days. So yeah, the even during the Cold War, the Russians were supplying a fair amount of energy to Western Europe, and in ways that surprisingly mirror today's tensions and politics. Going all the way back to, like, say, the Kennedy administration in 1963, just after the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink. The United States was saying, "Hey, I don't think it's such a good idea for us to export supplies of things like piping, for pipelines." To the Soviet Union, because they're going to be building pipelines that are actually supplying energy to NATO allies in the West, and there's a risk of dependency being created there that we don't think is such a good idea. Um, that was unsuccessful. The Europeans were okay with those pipelines getting built and taking those supplies, and for the most part, um, there was a stable relationship between Western Europe and Russia in terms of taking Russian energy supplies all through the Cold War. Including during the early '80s, when the Solidarity uprising in Poland caused the United States to again say, "Hey, we don't think it's such a good idea, you guys planning to increase your dependence on natural gas coming in from the Soviet Union." And there's this real issue we see in Poland where we don't want the Soviets doing, some of the things they've done before, like the Prague Spring in Poland. And so the Reagan administration in particular was trying to get Europe to back off of commitments. And there was a very divided response inside Europe at the time as to what to do. And the long story short is they went ahead with the Russian supplies anyway. So these kind of tensions diplomatically between the Western allies on exactly how to handle and use and not become dependent on Russian energy supplies goes back a really long way. And so does, by the way, on again, off again cooperation between the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and the OPEC countries. So that's happened many times in the 20th century, and then again it started happening in the 21st in 2016 after U.S. and Canadian shale producers just crushed the market with a huge flood of additional supply and cratered the price. We went from well over $100 a barrel to 20 in the space of about it was 15 months or so,
Wow.
somewhere like that. That was a crisis for Russia and for the OPEC countries, and so they started talking together again about behaving as a greater bloc, and sometimes people would call it OPEC plus. So Russia is itself sometimes a cartel extension of OPEC, and a way of thinking about that again is they don't necessarily want there to be too much supply. They cartel countries like that, they want oil to be priced $1 less per barrel than creates a recession. That's it. No cheaper, right? And Russia's that way. Now, with the Ukraine war, we've exited this period of kind of quasi stability. um, it was the case that Russia and Western Europe had a pretty steady relationship until right around that time. And if you look at between late 2021 and September of 2022, Russian energy supplies to Europe were in order, de facto embargoed, sanctioned, and then sabotaged. That's not a stable supply relationship. So the energy flows coming out of Russia are therefore getting globally rewired as a result of all that. And it's just a different regime than we had for decades before that, for sure.
There was a little bit of pipeline politics, after the fall of the Soviet Union. I remember, cutoffs through Ukraine transit pipelines and things like that. But you're saying under the Soviet Union, really remarkable stability and reliability of energy being delivered from now Russia to the EU.
I think that's what the historical record says. I mean, for the most part, when you saw kind of interference in that relationship, it was really coming from the U.S. Telling its allies, "Hey, let's be careful here." But it wasn't a situation of the Soviets, turning the valve to kind of intimidate Europe, as they did during the Orange Revolution with Ukraine, which I think is what you were referencing a minute ago. That's true. Prior to the current Ukraine war, when Russia wasn't getting what it wanted geopolitically in Ukraine, what they did was something very clever. They basically put enough gas in the pipes to meet the needs of everybody to the west of Ukraine and not Ukraine itself. And so essentially it was you can satisfy your customers or take care of yourselves, but you can't do both essentially. And that's what they had done during that window. So yeah, it wasn't just the lead up to the current Ukraine war. There was a little fiddling around by Russia before then. What happened in the lead up to the Ukraine war this time, though, was essentially Russia was meeting its contracts coming directly to say Germany through Nord Stream, but they were not making the extra deliveries that they had been before. And that essentially created an artificial shortage and price spike. And who knows? But this one armchair quarterback looking backwards says that was your first signal that real trouble was coming. Was drawing down European storage.
Onwards from Russia.
Yes. All right. Let's now go on a world tour. We're going to go all over the place. So this is no car. This is an Enverus term, which is again not OPEC, Canada, America, or Russia. So it's everybody else. These are dozens of countries all over the world, and about 30 of them have noteworthy production. So enough to where they're not lumped into other, essentially, and they are by the end of 25 will be producing about a third of world supply, so about 32.3%, about 34 million barrels a day. To collectively, they're about the size of OPEC, right? All of them together, and because it's spread across 30 countries, you spread risk around. There's less likelihood that any one of them is going to do something that's out of geopolitical leverage. It's kind of hard. And it also means that a new supplier coming on or off is less disruptive generally because of their size being smaller. This is a very diverse group of countries. So, OPEC and Russia, for practical purposes, those are state owned enterprises. Their production decisions are politically directed. This group of countries, no car, man, you got all of the above. So, you've got countries as diverse as Norway and China. And their behaviors and their levels of transparency, what their goals are, very different in this group of countries. So you kind of got all of the above. Um, this has been a pretty flat production group of countries. So what's happened over the past 20 years is as one goes down, another one tends to come up. Like a Venezuela will go away, and a Brazil and Guyana will appear or grow. And a North Sea will go down and something else will come up, but there's not been a whole lot of net new production addition over the past 20 years, and we don't really see that changing. So and the reasons have less to do with like an OPEC or a Russia, where because they have such tight political control that they exert to not oversupply. This group's different. Essentially, the wave of exploration that we saw in the 1980s following the 1970s energy crisis, man, oil and gas companies got busy all over the world looking for more supplies, a lot of it offshore, increasingly a lot of it deep offshore. And that activity kind of peaked in the 80s, and it's now about a quarter of what it used to be. Um, Interestingly, the largest oil and gas companies, the international oil companies, they're still at about the same levels that they were 15 years ago, but a great number of the smaller ones have kind of sharply curtailed their activity. So there's not a whole lot of exploration going on in these countries, which is not bullish for a lot of supply being added, especially because a lot of this offshore activity has really long lead times. From a final decision to actually go produce to first oil, it might be a decade, and some of these projects, are double digit billions in terms of the capital commitments required. So it's good in a sense because it's a very diverse pool. It spreads risk around. It's in regions all over the world. But I would say recent market realities and political decisions have curtailed the idea of this group growing a whole lot, especially in the near term. The first hit was really the shale boom in North America because shale's supply can come on so rapidly, and the capital intensiveness of an additional shale development is much smaller than, say, a net new investment in a country like Guyana. So it can react to the market very fast. And so if you're an oil and gas producer committing many billions of dollars, are you really going to do that project? Because you might get oversupplied in the market by shale producers, and now your investment case is messed up. So that I think has been a real disincentive for a while now for these groups. The other one is a lot of these countries have political movements that are essentially anti the production of hydrocarbons in the first place. Sometimes even within their own country. So, like, look at the latest presidential election in Mexico. Great example. Obrador was actually pretty interested in getting Pemex into shape. A state-owned enterprise there. His successor isn't. She's not particularly interested. And you look at a lot of European producers. Their goal is to end hydrocarbons as fast as possible in their view. They're, um, they're not really looking to expand production. And some of these countries depend on international financing for this. And there's a lot of international monetary type organizations that have tried to sharply curtail fossil fuel financing. So there are a lot of dynamics that would suggest that regardless of how much resources in the ground, and there's a lot, it doesn't look bullish for this group of countries adding a lot of supply in the next several years. So that's a quick tour of NOCAR.
Yeah, no, that's I think quite useful, and gives a good sense of why that supply is not necessarily to be counted upon. I just you mentioned sort of the double digit billion price tag for some of the infrastructure requires these big offshore rigs. It sounds a lot like the kind of scale and complexity we're talking about with a nuclear plant, where taking a decade to come online. And as you're saying, the shale boom has made that maybe the same way cheap natural gas electricity generation in the U.S. has made large nuclear plants something that's not a good investment case. Really interesting to think about those dynamics.
That's right. And Chris, this would probably be a good time to point out that commodity prices are really interesting things. The information that comes from the signal that comes from a commodity price is an indispensably valuable piece of information. There's no substitute for it in terms of really understanding what you need to do in terms of supplier demand. However, when it's your only piece of information, um, it tends to produce some I think unfortunate outcomes because these commodity prices are quite sensitive, and because the demand for oil and gas is quite inelastic, and so when you have a shortfall, prices, as we've seen recently, can go very high very fast. And at the same time, you get slightly oversupplied. The reverse happens. But when your investment timelines are a decade long and your price signals can happen in days or weeks, those two things aren't necessarily aligned in terms of what you need to do to avoid that problem in the first place. And so, you've talked a lot on Decouple about how it seems troublesome to imagine nuclear, for example, succeeding without state involvement, because states can think on timeframes longer. They don't always do that, but they can think on timeframes longer than a typical investor horizon. And I think the deeper we get into deeper reserves of oil and gas, the more the timeframes may start looking like long-term political commitments than short-term investor attitudes. And so that I think is a risk.
One more clarifying question before we move on. You mentioned this big spike in exploration and production spurred by the OPEC crisis. Um, a narrative that I've heard is, listen, essentially we found all of the large productive deposits in the world. There's not much more to do there. Is that, would you contend that?
I don't know that that's true. And the other thing. Well, first of all, let's give credit where it's due. The A tremendous amount of effort was spent in the 80s and 90s going and finding all kinds of reserves and supplies, for sure. So not taking away from any of the work that was done there, and probably quite a lot of things have been discovered. There are also things that have been discovered, and some of which are even producing, which could produce or could produce at all that aren't being tapped today, or could produce quite a bit more if the incentive was there to do it. So just because it's found, quote unquote, doesn't really mean it's leveraged. So that's one thing. The other thing is that there's other stuff that people haven't been looking for very hard, I would argue, or trying to produce from, because there's just lower hanging fruit. So, for example, heavier oil supplies are believed to be in a lot of places. Nobody's really working on them because it's much easier to produce the lighter stuff. The oil sands you guys have in Canada is a great example of that. That represents quite a lot more supply. It's just we're not going after it first because it's more expensive to go after it. Another one is gas. So I would argue that nobody was looking for gas nearly as hard as they were looking for oil. But that doesn't mean it's not there. So you look at some recent discoveries; they're really quite large. And I mean, golly, the North Field of Qatar is 2,000 trillion cubic feet, 2,000 TCF. Um, uh,
Petafeet.
yeah, it's just an enormous supply. There's a lot more capital intensive to produce gas, especially if you're not going to use it right where you're producing it. If you're going to liquefy it and put it on a ship and send it to some global market, that's much more capital intensive. But that doesn't mean that that's not going to be what the future looks like. I just don't think people were necessarily looking for gas as hard as they were for oil. That doesn't mean it's not there.
Okay. Are we ready for our next stop?
Yeah. Well, let's go to Canada, Chris.
Love it.
One of your and my favorite two countries. So, you guys by the end of next year are just a shave under 6% of global supply, at like right at 6.2 million barrels. So pretty meaningful supplier for the world. And there are really kind of two large resources there. One is the oil sands, and the other one is really the Montney Formation, which is I think mostly exploited in Alberta, but also in BC, and that's mostly a natural gas and natural gas liquids producing formation. Really quite a large resource in both cases. So existing oil sands projects, ones where the kind of the mining sort of stuff is already set up, the heavy infrastructure and facilities. Some of them look like mines, some of them don't, depending on the type of oil sands. But once the upfront capex is put there for the core facilities, the marginal cost of producing additional barrels from those facilities is very competitive. So, as competitive as some of the lowest break-even prices of production in U.S. shales. So that's a major supply source for you guys, obviously, and you're producing synthetic crudes. You're producing bitumen diluents or dilutions of bitumen with diluents like natural gas liquids. So there's a lot of production coming from there, and there's still some conventional production coming from Canada as well, and a fair amount of gas production too. You guys just don't have a lot of enthusiasm for doing it. So, as a country, you're not really leaning in to producing all that you could, and you've also got a transport problem. Like the number of pipelines leaving the producing regions to go to markets has been constrained partly by your politics, partly by ours. So the number of ways that those molecules can get to market and which markets they can get to. So the Trans Mountain expansion and LNG Canada are going to provide some relief there for you guys in the near term. But I think overall, Canada, I would argue, is more concerned with reducing emissions than increasing production of drill bit hydrocarbons.
We got hammered pretty hard by the fracking boom and falling prices. My understanding was we needed a pretty decent price to be economically viable. But what you're saying is the existing operations where the capex has been sent, the infrastructure is there. It's pretty economic to keep those operations going.
That's right. It's kind of like think about another nuke plant analogy, maybe for a lot of your audience would be
That's helpful.
that when the nuclear plant is first built, it looks shockingly expensive. You run it for 20 or 30 years and it gets fully amortized, and then it runs for another 30 years after that. It's some of the cheapest power you can get over the long term, right? And so, maybe these facilities might be compared to that in a way, where they're quite expensive up front to first establish them, but marginal production from them is not very expensive.
And then those investments were made prior to the fracking boom, and they've kind of sat idle. And now there's a lot of capacity. The other thing I've heard, I forget if we're number, it's a shocking number, like the second or third largest hydrocarbon reserves in the world were tied up in these deposits. Is that true?
Yeah, I've many times I've heard my colleagues talk about the colossal nature of Canadian resource. Like it's just massive. There's a really large base of hydrocarbons there in Canada. It's quite big.
And I guess with the question being peak oil versus peak cheap oil, that's kind of where we have to maybe differentiate in terms of further capital investments to make the infrastructure that amortized eventually produces cheap oil.
Yeah, that's I think that's right. One thing to think about though is even the peak cheap oil thesis I would challenge a little bit because when you first get started with these things, they look really expensive. Like if you look at the original oil boom from shale in the U.S., the break-even prices were quite high. The folks hadn't figured out everything that they needed to figure out in order to make a drilled well as productive as it could be. And what's happened even in my time in the company over the past 8 years is extraordinary in terms of continued optimization of well designs, the continued optimization of basically field development, like how do you maximize a drilling a DSU essentially so that the unit as a whole is producing more. I mean, the productivity is really pretty impressive on a per barrel basis compared to what it cost in 2008. Like it's pretty dramatic, right? And so you could imagine that similar sorts of productivity gains on a per dollar basis are findable. Once these projects get going, it just takes time, and yes. Ultimately, where again you can steel man, like I think a Nate Hagen's type argument a little bit is that the technologies required to do that and some of the upfront capexes are not trivial. So, I think you and I were talking once about a project I heard about in one of the former Soviet republics in Central Asia, where they tapped a reservoir there, really quite productive, but the pressures, the temperatures, and the chemistries of the fluids coming out of the ground were so challenging that my understanding was that they had to do unique metallurgy never done before to figure out what to make the pipes and valves out of that wouldn't just be immediately corroded by this stuff coming out of the ground. That's non-trivial. You look at what needs to be done to drill the Brazilian pre-salt formation off the coast of Brazil. This is a really technically challenging project. So the upfront innovation and capital investment and investor patience seems to be on an upward trend in many cases for some of these supplies. And that's where I think you can kind of take that argument that the Nate Hagens of the world might suggest as being, hey, that's a little bit of a red light on the dashboard. And I wouldn't disagree with that.
Okay, Canada, we're saving America for last here.
Yeah. So, things really turned around from, when I was sitting in the back seat of that car.
Right.
We are a massive producer in the U.S. now, and we weren't as recently as 8 years ago or
So,
eight
it's
or
like
10
going
years
back to
ago.
World War II. U.S. is number one producer. things are tapering off in the 70s. Then you get into the offshores and sort of kind of plateau or keep things stable, but the economy is continuing to grow, and then we get into these shales and everything goes crazy.
That's
Is
right.
that
Yeah.
accurate?
Yeah, I think that's right. So the U.S. I think we're saying is going to be about 21.2 million barrels by the end of next year, and we were 6.6 in 2005, so it's about 3.5x. We had regulated gas prices by the set by the federal government not that long ago in our past, and you could see $18 gas. Now it's three, and we're the largest natural gas producer in the world. I think by quite a lot. And we have really massive reserves as well. So what shale did for the U.S. and for the world is really dramatic. Like think about the shortfall we were starting to experience between supply and demand in like say the 2006, 7, 8 sort of time frame, right as the financial crisis hit, and you saw really high prices there for a bit. The world oil demand had just been marching up and up and up and up and up for a decade, and there wasn't that much new supply coming on. And that ultimately resulted in a bit of a price shock there in that time frame. Imagine the United States shale revolution having not occurred at that point in time, and you can kind of get where people were, like the guy that wrote the book "The Party's Over" back during that time period, saying this is it. We've kind of peaked, and now it's nowhere but down from here, and that's going to have a really really frightening effect on things. And that's obviously not what happened at all. U.S. shale and then Canadian shale came roaring on and completely rewired everybody's expectation about what to do and how to do it. And so, that was quite a reprieve in some sense, and then also an expansion of energy supply. I've heard it said, and I think we might have to set aside like some of you guys' uranium deposits when we say this, but U.S. shale might be the largest single primary energy source ever discovered. It's very big in any case. It's not to be taken lightly, and so that innovation by U.S. shale producers was really quite profound in terms of its impact. So I think some folks now looking forward and say, okay, that's great, but all you did was delay the inevitable, and shale is hard to produce from, and we can kind of see the peak from here, and then things get really bad. I think that's one of the theses that we've been entertained with. And so our view, I think, is a little bit more nuanced than that. So we would say that today, if you kind of leave geopolitical considerations where they are, just kind of steady state, and you look at GDP growth in the world, kind of try to keep things on a more or less linear path, not with any big surprises like wars or geopolitical, you know,
Big
distant.
if these days, but sure, we'll
Right?
entertain
Yeah,
the
I agree.
thought
It's
experiment.
quite touchy at this point, it seems. But let's just say the current state sort of smooths out and stays that way for a while, and supply and demand balances would be what we would roughly expect. Then what we would tell you is let's just focus on the Permian because it's so much of U.S. production. What we would tell you is that the Permian would stay about where it is with a small amount of growth for about another 10 years, based on where the economic delineations are of what the break-even prices are producing from different areas and different formations of rock. And then after that, if you wanted that same production level to maintain, then what you would need is a higher price signal. In other words, a signal from the market that was calling on a little bit more dollars per barrel in order to incent the production from those rocks that are just not quite as economic to produce from, but there's a lot of them, right? So the overall message being, does it look like a higher price signal is embedded in that? Yes. Does it look like we all of a sudden run off the end of a geological cliff? No. So, because of the analytics that we produce that I described a little bit earlier at the intro, we've got a view to things that aren't even reserves yet, things that we would call geologically viable, using lots of subsurface data that we've done a lot of analysis on. And so, from our point of view, when we look at it and say, are we imminently going to run out of resources in places like the Permian in the next few years? No. Would we need a higher price signal to produce the same returns that investors expect today in order to produce from some of the non-core acreage? Yes. Yeah. So if investor expectations remained what they were in terms of the returns that they want, global price regimes and supply regimes and demand regimes were similar to what we see now, you're going to see a higher price call to produce from those places after about another decade on the oil side. Um, the runway's a lot longer on gas, by the way. Even when you account for the exports and additions from new LNG terminals coming online, the ones unaffected by the LNG pause of the Biden administration. So, anyway, does that start to help answer the question where we see
Yeah,
things
no,
going?
for sure, for sure. I mean, I'm just still sort of distracted, caught up in this idea of like this alternative history of no shale revolution and what the world geopolitics look like, and that is just way too big of a question to kind of throw at you. But that's kind of why I've been staring off into space a little bit here.
Yeah.
It is interesting. I mean, we have the head of the International Energy Agency saying that we're headed for a glut, just oversupply. Which changes that question of how much oil we're actually going to need. Um, Seems to be a thesis common to Decouple guess that there's a lot more economic growth in middle income countries coming. What's your projection in terms of just what kind of demand we're going to have for oil heading into the future and how that's going to impact price?
Yeah, so I think we're our visual of what that looks like as we look out into kind of the 2030s. If I'm not mistaken, from our research, I recall seeing a number that looks like 110 million barrels per day. If we look at about 10-ish years, and so don't hold me to that exactly because I'm going from memory. And then we're not really looking much further than that. That's on the very far end of what our investor audiences and our producer audiences care about in most of our day-to-day conversations. After that, you start getting into these really contentious sort of views about what will or won't happen. Electrification of surface transport, policy declarations about what goals are versus what people will actually do. And you see very big divergences between those things. And then you start getting into debates, and I personally tend to be on the side of first principles in physics and chemistry and economics. And I often look at these things and say, I don't think that this is as simple as you think it is. Like, simply replacing as you say a lot, Chris, hydrocarbon services with other things is a lot harder than I think you might think it is, right? And so policies change in the face of political pressure, even in societies that aren't that democratic. And so it's easy with the bravery of being out of range of some future decision of saying you're going to do this or you're going to do that. When you're in range of the consequences of that choice, I think people get more flexible about what they will and won't do, and so it gets really hard to try to vision out how all that's going to play out. But I tend to be with folks like Roger Pilkey Jr. and others that say, and this is me personally, again, not necessarily in Enverus view, that the iron law of climate, as Roger describes it, which is at the end of the day, people are going to choose their economic self-interest as they see it if they're allowed to. I think if that's the case, then you see more and more and more hydrocarbon demand looking far into the future, probably. Just on the basis of first principles and economics, and that would be hotly contested. That's more of an opinion of mine than somebody else's. But I would just look at coal demand and coal supply right now. I mean, we're burning more coal than ever, and it looks to be up and to the right as far as we can see right now. It's unclear why that wouldn't continue to be true for hydrocarbons unless we see some really significant advances in technology, more so than we have. And of course, people like you and me would like to see some of those be nuclear, and we certainly could displace a lot of molecule burn for atom splitting if we wanted to.
No, it is interesting. I mean, every form of primary energy has increased except for nuclear. We're producing it slightly less. It'll probably go up again now that the Chinese builds are coming along. But we still get twice the amount of energy out of biomass that we do out of nuclear. So ripe for some growth there, I would say. So we've talked about some probably more on the sort of geologic side in the U.S. But as promised, this episode we're also looking at the geopolitics and I guess the environmental politics affecting the U.S. sector. So why don't we get into that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. What I thought I would do is I'd talk a little bit about things in the U.S. First, because as we just saw, the U.S. has gone from being, not much of a supplier back in 2005 to being, the leading country in the world as a supplier now, which is incredible.
Two Saudi Arabia's worth of
Yeah,
production.
it's
Yeah.
just colossal. Like it's really, really big. And so, what's going to happen in the U.S. looking ahead? And I don't think people realize just how significant the challenges are to production potentially looking ahead into the future from the standpoint of what people want politically. So a lot of people don't know. I would imagine a lot of your listeners don't know that Colorado just earlier this year, Senate Bill 24-159 was put to the Senate that said, "Hey, let's just not produce oil and gas here anymore at all. Starting in 2030, we're done." Well, Colorado is a top 10 United States state for energy production. The bill didn't make it out of committee, but a lot of folks backing it are saying they want to put it on the ballot as a ballot initiative. Would it pass? I don't know. The chances are non-zero. I mean, it's not zero that it won't pass. And the folks, a lot of the NGOs are behind it are the usual suspects, the Colorado Sierra Club, as an example, and the Sierra Club generally just doesn't want hydrocarbons produced. So that's a risk. I would look at the Mountain Valley Pipeline as a great example of what you can do with enough determination and enough tort. That was a 3-year project that was made a 10-year project and was very, very barely by the skin of its teeth finally successful after congressional action and a Supreme Court case and lots of high wire politics. And first gas finally flowed last month through the Mountain Valley Pipeline. It could have flowed 7 years earlier. There were bankruptcies, lawsuits, all kinds of crazy stuff. I would argue that without some sort of tort reform or permitting reform, as Manchin was calling it in the Senate, it's going to be really hard to build another interstate pipeline in the United States, and without that, that is going to limit and or curtail production. It just is. So that's a serious thing. Look at presidential politics and international pipelines like Keystone XL, for example. We were going to take 800,000 more barrels of your heavies from Canada and supply our refineries because our refineries really like that for the way that they're tuned. I like that kind of energy integration potential between our two countries. Canada and America, Mexico together. I mean, we could be the world superpower in terms of energy producers and also be really quite insulated from geopolitical drama in the rest of the world in full cooperation. Um, you know, it was approved, then it was not approved, it was approved, it was not approved, and it went back and forth, between Obama and Trump, and then Biden. I think it was Biden's first day in office. He killed Keystone XL. So that's not a stable environment when policy is that volatile for projects like that need really long time frames. There's been a recent move to use the Endangered Species Act in Texas. I think with the sagebrush lizard in Texas and the Permian properly, New Mexico as well. Endangered Species Act can shut things down in some areas, depending on how it's used and how reasonable regulators are and how well regulators and industry can cooperate. And there have been people who've been looking for federal ways to intrude in what Texas does for a long time, and they've got one now. So I think there's that. People don't realize the Texas Railroad Commission, which has a huge influence on how oil and gas is produced in Texas. It's a body of 3 people. They're elected officials. One comes up for office every 2 years, and there was a time, a cycle or two ago, when Democrats from outside the state of Texas were pouring huge money into trying to get an environmentally minded Democrat elected to the Railroad Commission. The Railroad Commission has traditionally been oriented towards making sure that we produce oil and gas in Texas. I'm pretty sure that's not what that person's goal was. And the RRC has a huge impact. Anyway, this is all to say, I don't think anybody should take for granted that the United States productivity from these resources will continue unimpeded, because there are a lot of people would rather not see it done at all, regardless of how well or poorly it might adhere to the environmental regulations that are put in place. And I think generally our customers do quite a good job of adhering to the regulations that they're presented with. So, I mean, I would look at it this way, Chris. The Germans had the mother of all crises, if you ask me, with Nord Stream going away and natural gas suddenly impacting their economy. People like you and me might have looked at that event and said, well, of course, German politics will now become more rational about the 3 nuclear power plants that they have remaining. Of course, reality intrudes. You must adjust. No, it didn't. They went ahead and shut down those 3 reactors anyway, and now they're burning lignite in the name of the environment. I mean, reason and so on doesn't necessarily influence these decisions. I think as much as people take for granted, that's not necessarily how it works. So I guess bringing it all together, one of the things that I would like to say to any policymakers that might be listening to us today is the North American natural gas sector, U.S. and Canada combined, along with brilliant people from all over the world, especially South Asia. We have a huge number of South Asian employees in the oil and gas industry. We have people from Europe. We have people from Africa. People from all over the world came together and made this enormous supply of energy added to world markets. They gave us space and time, even in the midst of the current geopolitical turmoil, to be able to think ahead and act now to create better outcomes for the future instead of being in a crisis situation like I was in my childhood. Don't squander that gift. Use that gift of space and time. And people like you and me would say, for goodness sake, grab a shovel and start building some reactors. These things take a while. Use the time that we've been provided. And so I would make that appeal, really, to say that. And I would not take for granted that we're going to just keep producing like we have been, because I don't know that the politics say that we will. The geology is fine. I'm not sure that the politics are. So, I'll make another appeal too. Speaking of politics, people act like elections, oh, we just got to get past the next election and everything will be fine. Energy policies will be rational. There's always another election. Elections are not enduring victories. They can be important ones, but they're not enduring victories. The enduring victory is education. It's people understanding the fundamentals. And in a democratic society, a lot of people understanding the fundamentals. The general public needs to know more than they often do. And the places they learn are places like Decouple. And so, for those of you that have really been out there enjoying this podcast, as I have for the past 3 years, and everything that I've learned that I didn't know from the amazing guests that we've had and deep discussions, this outfit deserves your support. Join me and my wife Brandy for having made our support, because the world needs you, Chris, and we'd like to hear more great content coming from you.
Well, Jimmy, that's a beautiful place to leave it. Not just your shout outs for support there, but you tied things up really nicely, I think, in terms of the overall arching theme of this episode. Of course, we very much appreciate support. People can go to our Patreon and get in touch with me personally on LinkedIn or Twitter for more efficient donation mechanisms. But absolutely, we would appreciate any support. And as we have yours, Jimmy, and great video up on YouTube of that Baraka nuclear plant tour, and so much more on Decouple YouTube. Jimmy, thanks again, man. This was a real blast. I learned a lot. Yeah, we're integrating things here, and hopefully coming up with some good information for sound decisions to be made going into the future. So here's to the that continuing value of education overall. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Take care.
Bye for now.